All right, welcome back, folks. As some of you know, my name is Ben Fellows. I'm the CEO of Loop Software. Today, I am joined by Michael Scotto. Michael is the Senior Director of QA and Data Products at Niche. I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about Michael's journey. It sounds like it's been super fascinating. Michael, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, do you mind just starting off a little bit, sharing who you are, what you've done up to this point, a little bit about your journey at Niche? Because I really am excited to learn a little bit about how QA has changed as it's evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. I joined Niche about 9.5 years ago at this point. It was a much different, much smaller company at that time. We were about 20 people when I started. I was one of very small QA team at that time. And over the course of the last 9 years, particularly in the pandemic, we've grown quite a bit. We're now a company of about 350 people, and the QA team itself is about 20 people, all in. And so over that time, we've had to go through a lot of different evolutions. Something I've said kind of half jokingly over a few different times is that I've gotten the chance to get a new job every 2 to 3 years without actually having to find one. And that's one of the things that keeps me there is just that opportunity to reinvent.
I want to sort of put the I don't know, the horse before the cart, but in today's world at Niche, you guys, as I understand it, you're able to release 6 to 7 times a day. You seem super confident in your pipeline and what you've built. And I'm really excited to work backwards, but walk me through kind of what QA looks like today and some of the milestones that you guys have achieved.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we're in a state of kind of continuous evolution. I think we're the quality and reliability of our platform, our product is very high. It's extremely rare for us to have production incidents that aren't driven, say, by something like AWS weather or something like that that's out of our control. Um, we have a really high standard of quality that we've also been able to imprint on the org as a whole. I think quality is taken very seriously by the organization. We're the engine for it, the owners of it, but ultimately it's thought of as everybody's responsibility, and I think we've been strong drivers for that. Um, and so that's something I'm very proud of.
Awesome.
Um,
Oh,
yeah.
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say I can talk a little bit about just team structure, that sort of thing, or if you have anything else you're interested in, I can walk
Yeah,
you
no,
through
I'd
it.
love to learn about team structure. And then what also comes to mind is pipeline. Anytime you're releasing 6 to 7 times a day, I'm curious to know a little bit more about what your pipeline looks like. Is it heavy on the unit tests, integration tests? Are you doing stuff like seeding data? But I don't want to dive too into technical details. I just
Yeah.
know I'm curious about it. So let's start with team structure and kind of what it looks like, and maybe who's responsible for what.
Sure. So, we have, our primary, user-facing areas are, of course, the niche.com website, which, receives anywhere from, say, 200 to 300,000 visitors a day. And then, of course, we also have our partner portal that's, for our clients. And so those are, two of the big areas that we're focused on. Of course, we've got our back end, our microservice architecture, which it's got somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 microservices. In terms of our deployment pipeline, we have a pretty strong unit testing philosophy that's driven by our software engineers. Our unit test coverage is I don't have the exact percentages right in front of me, but they're pretty high. When it comes to our integration testing, I would say at this point, like I said, we're in the bit of an evolution. About 70% of our code base is exercised by integration and end-to-end tests at this point. Our ability to deploy is largely, driven by that. Our time from merging to, our dev branch to actually having code in production, on average is somewhere around 40 minutes. So we're doing that, like I said, or like you said, 6 to 7 times a day. To give you a perspective, 3, 4 years ago, we were maybe deploying twice a week. And so that's been an area of focus for our team to emphasize getting things into production quickly and slicing our work such that it's minimizing risk to do so.
Yeah, that's a stunning achievement, and props to you. And it's also really cool that you've been a part of that journey this whole time. I'm curious to know a little bit about um, if I took away certain parts of how you do quality, how does it impact? And what comes to mind, for example, is like, for example, could you have done that ever without those unit tests, or could you have ever done this without some of the end-to-end or integration components? Because one of the pieces that seems really fascinating to me about it is how interdependent each of these things are, and how oftentimes organizations get hyper focused on one thing, and then
Mhm.
they end up trying to apply that one thing in too many ways, right? Whether it's end to end instead of integration or unit tests. When it comes to this idea that you can go from a development branch to production in 40 minutes and that is stable, how do you define the roles of each of those things as someone leading the quality charge? And if any of them are taken away, what's the impacts that it have? Bit of an esoteric question, but are you following?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and I do think, I mean, there are many contributors to that level of productivity and success. I do think if you take any one away, it certainly diminishes our capabilities. I would say, in addition to the testing effort, I mean, the collaborative culture we have around quality is also something that is really fundamental. We're able to develop and release high quality code because that's baked in all the way through the process, not just uh, you can't inject it at the end, but often organizations try to do it that way. Um, and I would also just say I've got to give a shout out to our infrastructure team because they're the ones who've built such a reliable pipeline that we leverage for deployments. It's highly reliable. Rollback in the rare event we need to do it is very easy. And without that as well, that investment in infrastructure and site reliability engineering, we also wouldn't be able to accomplish what we have. Um, I would say, any one element, we take it away. Um, yeah, it would definitely make it harder to do what we're currently doing. And it was built up over a number of years to get to that point.
Got it. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you sort of talk about and giving credit to how much giving the whole organization thinking about quality, right? And obviously push to the left and thinking about acceptance criteria, all these other things, which is fascinating because I did just, yesterday read this LinkedIn post of someone who was on the quality side and they moved to the engineering leadership side, and they took pride in their, they took pride in how many quality teams that they've, dissolved in their career. And there's this weird thing happening in quality where this idea of someone who's in QA, right? It's, are they a software tester? And devs, if they do it perfectly, they shouldn't need someone to write tests. They should know, like, as part of their development. And I'm curious to know, have you thought about how quality fits into the organization today when it comes to its role as it's evolved in the last couple of years? I mean, it's less to do with your journey, I guess, and more state of the industry, but I'm sure your
Mhm.
journey probably impacts how you look at QA. So I'm curious to know a little bit about your perspective on how QA fits in as a role within an organization.
Absolutely. I think, one of the shifts that we've been really championing within my org, and there's been kind of waves as we've been at different stages of scale. When we were a company of 20, QA wore a lot of hats. We were doing the testing work, of course. We were writing automation. We were doing some business intelligence and business analysis work. We had heavy input into the product and what we were developing, and we were also the CS team, our customer support team at that time, responding directly to customer complaints. And so we were plugged in many different ways. And while that doesn't necessarily scale, and it's useful to introduce specialists in all those areas, it did inform just the breadth of potential QA's got. All the ways that quality and can manifest and can be manifested by a QA team. And so even as we've moved in the direction of focusing more on testing and not wearing these other hats, that has informed my philosophy that you know quality is not just testing. QA is not just testing. That's a skill. That's not a job. And so even if we call often, and I do as well, refer to QA engineers as testers, that's not the sum total of and not the limit of what we can contribute in terms of value.
Yeah.
Now, the way I see it is, I do think that it's useful to think about how to, be more efficient with your QA operation, how to amplify the impact of every member of your team. And the way to do that, in my view, is to lean more into the coaching aspects of the role, being something of a quality coach, so that everyone on the team can be thinking about how to make the highest value outcomes that they can.
Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. And it's interesting hearing that ownership over quality coaching, because I think that what ends up happening is sometimes we get stuck in the semantics of titles in some ways too, where it's like, oh, you should be a tester, not responsible for quality, or vice versa, where, well, developers should, they should be responsible for quality in their development. And the reality is I think that every team is so unique that we all are pulling towards the same goal, right? We all want stable software, and whatever mix, like what you guys seem to have found that works really well, particularly at scale, is ultimately, I think, the right way of doing it, as opposed to trying to say that there's right one set of terminology. I am curious, and this is a very specific logistics question, but so you're going from a development branch to production in 40 minutes. Is a developer interpreting any test failures? Are they updating any test automation that maybe is out of date because of their test? How does that process go? This is a very specific technical piece, but it is something I'm curious about, being that you guys also have this external team, or are you guys kind of doing that hand in hand with them as that release goes out?
I would say, aspirationally, I'd like to have, more of that kind of, developer contribution to, fixing tests as they break. There's still a little bit of siloing that we have to break down. I think that we're working on, and I see progress there. But today, I would say, we've got some of the typical problems you'd see in a lot of organizations, where we are playing catch up from time to time with our test coverage, and just keeping it current. It's not as automated as it could be yet.
Got it. Do you pair any of the automation with like exploratory? I mean, when it comes to thinking about these releases multiple times a day, I mean, how are you also ensuring that you just don't rely on automation? Because as you probably know, and I think a lot of people agree, if you run the same automation over and over again, you're just testing the same stuff over and over again, and you're not necessarily always thinking about the expanded coverage. What else are you pairing in today's world with what you are doing from an automation standpoint?
That's a great question. I would say first, yeah, spot on. I mean, you really risk hardening deficiencies by just running the same tests over and over again, or creating blind spots. And so, you know, that's a challenge we face. I think right now, we're perhaps a little over reliant, but on the whole uh, individuals just knowing things, aspect.
Yeah.
We have a QA team that is really, really keyed into just how our product is supposed to behave, what we're doing for the user, and that's valuable. But I think there's a sweet spot we haven't quite reached yet, where we are pairing that, reliance on automation to build a high degree of confidence, but regular auditing in the form of exploratory testing. I think that would be, that's kind of the direction we're looking to head more toward, and just having that assumed as part of QA engineers' capacity, that time to do a little bit of sort of structured wandering.
Got it. Awesome. I'm going to ask you to go back a couple years in your brain and think about working for the 20-person company, and thinking about primarily, I think, lessons learned, right? What worked, what didn't? What do you feel like maybe were some of the anti-patterns or fallacies that maybe you guys got stuck in for too long, with whatever you're comfortable for sharing. But if you could sort of put yourself back in that world and give yourself advice on how do you get to, at least from the outside, where you are today, which is a remarkably effective QA division, what lessons do you tell yourself about what worked well and what didn't work well?
That's another great question. I think, in terms of what worked well, um, having QA involved end to end, asking questions, sort of live planning and live sketching test plans during refinement meetings, that sort of thing, that all worked really well and gave us some great efficiency. I think in terms of what didn't work well at that time, I mean, one of the challenges we had was that, the way we scoped our work in general did not really was really not agile. It was still a pretty waterfall process, even if we were doing daily stand-ups and sprint retros and such. Our deliverables were enormous, and that introduced a lot of risk. Covering the whole surface area and having to manage regressions and that sort of thing. So pushing harder for, I think, just process improvement and trying to influence continuous improvement that way, I think would have been useful at that time. But that certainly wasn't a unique challenge to QA the way we were breaking down work. I think everybody felt that pain in a variety of ways, but QA in particular, since we're quote unquote last in the process, any issues or inconsistencies, they kind of accumulate and land in our area in a different way.
Got it. Yeah, and it's interesting. I keep hearing sort of organizational buy-in and organizational change, and at least if there's one lesson so far that I'm taking away from this conversation, it's a reminder that the worst thing that you can do, and this is where I can kind of sympathize with people saying, well, QA isn't, a job, it's everyone's responsibility. But the worst thing you can do is not have organizational buy-in for making quality software, right? And the way I describe it, and I'm curious if it sort of aligns with what you've seen, is I think product people are fantastic about giving you kind of the utopian way that someone's going to use the software. And I think developers are fantastic about taking a set of instructions and turning it into reality. But they both have these gaps, and Scrum about sizing, but they both have these gaps, right? Where a product person, they need someone to question their utopian reality and say, what if, or a developer who maybe hasn't talked to customers every day, if they're left to interpret something, they might interpret it wrong, or they might think that there's some way that someone uses their product. And to me, it's like if you ignore titles, there's this perfect role for someone who understands the product in a way that users use it, and they question the reality, and they question how a developer would interpret something, and they fill in all those gaps. And as far as you can do that upstream, the better. I'm curious to know the role that leadership has played in empowering your team to do that, and how you've approached this, being a leader on your team, trying to get other people on board. And I guess your interpretation of my sort of summary of it too.
No, I think it's a pretty good summary. I mean, and that's one of the key values I think that dedicated QA can contribute is, I'm certainly not the first person to observe that QA, quality assurance, QA, question asker, it's the job of a QA fundamentally is to ask the unasked question. Most often we do that through executing tests, but I think that applies in the broadest sense. We should be doing that at every stage of the process. And I've tried to encapsulate what is QA, a variety of times for my team, as a writer, that sort of thing. But being sort of professionally skeptical, being professionally curious is kind of the broad lens, and having somebody who's slightly removed from the development process, slightly removed from, the kind of design process, that extra perspective is really useful. In terms of how leadership has helped to foster that, I think that really just speaks to the culture of our company, which is one of collaboration, one of generosity and helping each other out. And also, we really strongly encourage continuous feedback. And, one thing that I focus on as a leader for anyone in QA is coaching on how to give feedback. I mean, a large part of our job is sort of delivering bad news, telling people what's wrong about what they've done. And you have to be a really skilled communicator in order to be listened to effectively advocate for slowing down and fixing issues.
Yeah, no, I think emotional intelligence is one of the most overlooked pieces of like what is a quote unquote technical job, right? I think that we are just stuck in the middle of so many competing parties that our ability to communicate with them is so important. Something that listening to you comes to mind, by the way, is in today's world, how big are the things that you're trying to build? Like you mentioned kind of that you were still doing sort of waterfall planning and that you were doing that. I would imagine if you're, releasing 6 to 7 times a day, How small are you guys able to get the feature work that you're doing for your developers in order to package it in a testable way that doesn't introduce much risk? Because that, I would imagine, was a big impact when you go from these much larger code heavy releases to much smaller bite size pieces when it comes to minimizing risk, and the ability for a regression suite to effectively not just get so broken and unmaintained. Am I barking up the wrong tree, or is that something that you've noticed makes a difference?
I do think that makes a difference. I think it makes a difference, in terms of how you think about, increments of value. Um, I think especially the larger you scale up and have multiple teams working in the same repository solution at once, the more important it is to merge your code more frequently, just because um, a lot of other people might be impacted by changes you're making. And so doing that merge more frequently can reduce that impact, and reduce risk. I think, for us, when it comes to, say, any release on the back end is generally going to be pretty small. It might be like one new endpoint, a schema migration, like something relatively straightforward. On the front end, we still do have, big releases in terms of the user-facing perspective, but we might be using feature flags or that sort of thing in order to allow us to merge smaller increments without compromising the user experience. Um, but though basically scoping smaller, but also thinking about what it is to have the code in production, like that doesn't necessarily mean users are interacting with it yet.
Got it. Yeah. So you've done, 3, 4 years ago, 20-person company. Today, over 300. I want to understand your perspective on what QA looks like in the next 3 years for you guys, and what are some of the goals that you're driving towards? Is it more continuous deployment, development kind of stuff? Is it more automation coverage? Is it less bugs being reported? Like, what does QA look like 3 years from now for your company, and how are you measuring success, and what are you trying to optimize?
Sure. Before I jump into that, I do want to clarify so that I don't over exaggerate or oversell our growth. So we were 20 people about 9 years ago. We were
Oh,
probably like
excuse me. Well,
80
that's
people.
what you get for doing 10
Yeah.
minutes of research on LinkedIn. Sorry about that.
No
That's
worries,
my
no
fault
worries.
entirely.
Yeah, but we have, in the course of the pandemic, grown from 80 people working in an office together to being fully distributed workforce, 350 people 3 years later.
Wow.
So it we did have a big change. It just wasn't a full literal order of magnitude. But yeah. Um, in terms of looking towards the future, what I see, for our team is, essentially our QA engineer role as it stands today is largely manual testing. Like there is automation, like everybody in our group writes code to some degree, but leaning more into the automation side of things to the point where every QA engineer is spending about half their time on automation. And then the other half of their time on, manual and exploratory testing, maintenance, coaching, and also just impacting other parts of the software development lifecycle with a quality mindset. But about half of their time would be automation. We do have a dedicated SDET team today that is responsible for. They are the ones largely writing most of our integration and end-to-end tests. They're also the group that's building the framework and getting that integrated into our CI/CD pipeline. The way that team will evolve is there will be less emphasis on test writing, which I think should really be owned by the QA engineers and their product teams because they'll have the best knowledge of what's necessary. Migrating to more of a test ops model where really it's a small team focused on our actual automation platform, like essentially as a product with internal users. And so turning that team more or less into an automation product team. Um, and they'd provide support, standard setting, coaching to help teams mature their automation progress. But largely, it'd be the QA engineers driving automation.
Do you see yourself sort of going down the model of trying to get to a framework where your QA engineers are able to write kind of the human readable test cases and underneath is all the automation when you say that? Or are you saying more of just like best practices and standards and that they're still contributing from like writing code? I'm curious to know that just a tad more when you say something like automation platform.
It's I'm not. I'm honestly I'm not fully sold on the value of doing kind of like Cucumber, making it like so human readable. There's just a lot of maintenance work that goes into that, a lot of overhead. Really, I mean, these are folks who, our end-to-end testing. We use Playwright, JavaScript. Um, Really having a team capable of, doing, understanding the fundamentals of object-oriented programming, creating page objects, and not that using Cucumber is not writing real code or anything like that. I don't want to diminish that, but like actually getting closer to sort of the raw stuff.
Got it. That makes total sense. So I'm curious to know a little bit about how you scaled up the team. Are
Mhm.
you, hiring? Are you putting up jobs? You're using recruiter? Just I'm curious to know. I mean, to go up to a 20-person team and to make the right hires is hugely commendable on itself. Much less all the other success that it sounds like you've been able to achieve. What's been your approach for hiring, and what advice would you give to anyone who is either already in the world of QA and looking for opportunities, or maybe thinking about career change or something like that? How have you approached scaling this team and who you want to hire?
Sure. So, we've tried to hire, take a pretty open mind in terms of, the who's a quote unquote good fit for the QA role. I mean, it really isn't just about hard skills at all. For myself, I was a career changer. I was an English major, and I had studied filmmaking, and I was writing children's books in my prior career. I rebooted with QA, turned out to be a great fit for me, but it wasn't my hard technical skills that got me my first job. And so I think about that a lot. What sort of non-technical skills are we looking for? Obviously, it's useful to have people who, we've got folks with CS backgrounds, kind of more formal technical training. We've got boot camp people. We've got folks who are just like me. We're starting from scratch in tech, but had that sort of insatiable curiosity that I think is maybe the most fundamental asset of someone in QA. And so, looking for that combination of technical aptitude, interest, combined with deep empathy for others, and also just a real strong drive to learn. QA doesn't need to know everything, but we need to know how to find out everything. And so those are the kinds of skills I'm generally looking for. And that, casting that wide net certainly made it easier for us to scale up more rapidly.
Yeah. I mean, listening to this conversation, and as we start to get towards the tail end of it, it's at the risk of sounding like I'm sucking up to you. What's really amazing to hear that you've achieved is that you've built a quality-minded organization, but you've still continued to carve out a niche and a reason for quote unquote QA people to exist, right? I think that something that's this weird, almost imposter syndrome of QA is that, well, if product people could write perfect acceptance criteria and developers could write perfect code, technically, like, quality doesn't need to exist because everyone's doing quality. And it's really amazing to hear that you can have this really highly functioning organization, yet still this role that so many people are in today and that so much of us are in that can really pair with it beautifully. So I don't know that there's a question built in here, but other than it's really a cool and aspirational thing to see what you've achieved.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that the value a dedicated QA organization is, honestly, I think it's irreplaceable. That human creativity. I mean, you think about people who are consumers, users of websites. They're insanely creative. They do all kinds of unanticipated things with
Frustratingly
whatever you
creative,
build.
yes.
Yes, and trying to keep up with that is very difficult, especially because product engineering QA, we have a lot of the same goals in the big picture, but our primary incentives might be somewhat different. And I think it's really useful to have a function that's willing to pump the brakes and focus first and foremost on quality. Of course, you have to be pragmatic. You have to have trade-offs. Not any one of those three groups can win all the time and be a highly functional organization. But I think having someone whose primary responsibility is asking questions about quality is just extremely useful. And I don't think it's even really fair to expect a software engineer to fully replace that.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I want to say thank you for joining us, and we're right at the half an hour mark, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I want to offer you the final word if anything else comes to mind or anything else you want to share, and just the final thoughts.
Oh, thanks. No, I mean, it was a real pleasure joining you, this afternoon, and I'm always grateful to advocate for that strong, independent QA org. I would just say to my fellow QAs out there, you know, hold the line, but also make sure that you're willing to hear those other perspectives. Our empathy can't just end at the user; it's got to be extended to our colleagues as well.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you. Oh, excuse me, Michael, thank you for joining. And for everyone else, you can find more of this content on the website, workwithloop.com, or the YouTube channel. And then, Michael, is there anywhere else that they should check out for any more of your content? Your LinkedIn profile, I know you occasionally post, but do you post in blogs or anything like that? I should have asked you before, but just...
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm just getting it off the ground, but I have my blog, thequalityindex.com. That's where I share my thoughts on QA specifically, but also leadership. Again, I said broad view of quality. It's about quality assurance, quality leadership, quality living. Those are kind of the three legs of it.
Awesome. We'll talk to you in the next episode. Appreciate it. See you, everybody.
All right, thanks.